countries registered and across many time zones. We're also joined by my colleagues from Educate Services, and Katie Goldsmith, with whom you've been speaking or corresponding, is also sitting in as well. The aim of the sessions this morning, we're going to have a general overview of who we are and what we do. And the aim of the session is to convey to you what it is we've learned working with schools in the area of performance management and appraisal, both in the UK and internationally. We're going to focus on how the schools we work with are using a marriage, essentially, of our educational expertise and a piece of technology that we use to support schools visualize their processes. One of the key aims this morning is to try to convey to you the philosophies that we have around performance management and how it is we support schools developmentally in order to develop their staff and their own organizations. Some housekeeping this morning. We're going to have around 30 minutes of a guided presentation, a brief 10-minute session of question and answer at the end. You should have a console on your screen indicating where to ask questions. Happy to take questions as well during the course of the talk, and Katie will be monitoring those for me. We are recording the webinar, and it'll be available from Katie following this presentation. In the footer of each of the slides, I've tried to indicate the theme that the slide is touching upon. So looking at the presentation later, you should be able to see quite clearly which themes we're touching upon. Just a brief 30 seconds on myself. My name is Leyton Jones. I'm a product director here at Educate Services, and I run the part of the company which deals with performance management, both in the UK and internationally. I was previously a school leader. I'm also a trained inspector in Wales. You may pick up my accent as Welsh. And in the last 2 to 3 years, I project managed hundreds of school performance management projects, and numbers of those have been international as well. So, what does Educate Services do? In one sentence, I've tried to summarize here what it is we do. We help schools articulate their performance and value systems and give them a tool to help them visualize these two concepts for all stakeholders. So the main aim of the presentation this morning is to convey to you how it is we're working with schools internationally to achieve this. I've got plenty of examples for you to have a look at as well. In terms of our approach to performance management and appraisal of colleagues in schools, we take a very simple, very efficient approach. It's based around the idea that performance management should be an evolving, continuous development model. When we start working with many schools, we find they are basically working around annual objectives, and our influence in this area is to move this into a more continuous development model, and we look at those ideas working later. We're very much interested in terms of the idea of performance frameworks and how it is schools monitor or understand how well their colleagues are performing. And one of the key points we'll make this during the presentation is around performance frameworks. As a company, we have some quite significant principles regarding how performance should be viewed. Partnership is extremely important to us, and when we start looking in a few seconds at the way we work with schools, hopefully what will come across is that it is a reciprocal, shared partnership approach between the appraiser and the appraisee. And we'll have a look at that working in more detail in a few seconds. The key point here as a company that we would stress regarding our approach are the two last words there: over time. For many, many years, looking at practice, not looking at individual single lesson observations or one round of learner outcomes or test results, but that any view of performance ought to be in the round from a number of pieces of evidence and based over time. And we think the last 3 years is a good prism or a good window to look at some of this practice carefully, calmly. When I wrote out to you earlier this week to ask of your interest regarding the presentation, one of the responses was where the locus of control resides in terms of who's responsible for development. Our view, very squarely, is that it is the individual who's responsible for their own development. the organisation clearly is responsible for them, but the individual ultimately is accountable for their own performance. And the way that we work is to try to visualise this for schools and moving forward from there. Okay, when we start working with schools, these are some of the themes that school leaders share with us. When we first start working with schools, we talk to them strategically about what their aims are, what their concerns are, and what difficulties they have. And these key themes here are something that in each of our project documents, these are themes that appear, if not 100% of the time, they're at least in the 90% range. Many schools want to have the same approach for performance management across all members of staff, which is linked to the school-wide consistency. They're looking for a transparent, objective, equitable system. They're very keen to move to a more continuous development model rather than looking at objectives in terms of performance management. And a key theme we're going to look at later is how it is we visualize performance for school leaders, governors, inspectorates, and so forth in a very simple, straightforward way. Many of our international schools and independent schools are very keen to ensure that any performance framework that they use to look at the performance of their colleagues is reflective of their school value systems. So I've prepared later in the presentation some examples from a couple of our schools where you should be able to see clearly that they're emphasizing both the academic impact of the teacher or the colleague plus the extracurricular or cultural or ethos-based impact as well. We'll have a quick look at how we can support interfacing performance management with inspection frameworks and governance. And we'll look, the ideas regarding activating the individual and managing evidence should come out as byproducts of the presentation. And I did write to everybody earlier this week regarding pay progression. And that's something we will touch upon very briefly. So these are the kinds of themes that school leaders talk to us about. And occasionally, they also mention children learning. So that makes me smile occasionally. It seems to be very much down the line in terms of people's interest in terms of performance management. Okay, this image is from a recent workshop from a group of 30 independent school leaders. And as you can see here, these are the things that they wanted an effective, robust performance management system to deliver for them. I'm not going to go through the image in great detail, but you can see there essentially they wanted it to be an easy, effective process. They wanted committed, enthused, valuing their staff in the top sector there. And on the right-hand side there, again, they want to ensure that in any effective performance management approach, impacts upon learners' outcomes. Okay, we're going to move now into a bit more substantive area of the presentation. Our starting position around performance management is that we think, A, most people are good at their job, most parts of their job, most people want to get better at their job, and most people want personalized support programs. The challenge for school leaders is how do organizations capture and articulate A, and how do they visualize or measure the impact of their support for colleagues, which is C. And that's very much where we are in terms of our approach to this. Okay, we're going to have a look at performance management through the prism of a continuous development model. This is an extremely simple concept. Okay, it's about looking at performance as an ever-evolving process. And to do this, okay, we advocate that schools develop performance frameworks for each role within their school, and we'll look at examples of these. They're very simple documents. We then advocate that schools determine a continuum in order to measure the impact or the success of the individual within their framework. Some examples we'll look at today might use the terms outstanding, good, requiring improvement, or expert, accomplished, developing. It's entirely up to schools to determine how it is they'd like to articulate performance. And a point that we'd like to make here, this is extremely important to us. We're very keen about activating individuals and supporting CPD from within organizations. We feel that the greatest resource that schools have in terms of CPD is their staff body. And working within the architecture that we advocate will identify best practice for us and allow us to use those people to develop our people. And the third point here, before we look at the ideas working in real life, is that working over time together, we would expect or advocate that the appraiser and the appraisee maintain the performance framework, setting development aims which support the development of the individual and that of the organisation. So all we have is a list of things that are linked to my job, how well I'm doing them, and we understand how well I'm doing them based in agreement with myself and my appraiser. It's a very simple model. So what is a performance framework? It's nothing more than a simple list of things that I need to do in my role. So what I've got here, and we'll pause on the screen for a few seconds, is an example of a performance framework for a teacher. This one comes from a school in the UK. And what we have on the screen here in the centre, in this area here, this is the performance framework used to support this teacher's practice. These happen to be the national teaching standards for England, and we'll have a look at some other examples in a few seconds. But the basic premise of our approach to performance management is that every member of staff should have a performance framework, and there should be an understanding of how well it is the individual is performing within this framework. So we can see here that for standard 1.1.1, to establish a safe and stimulating environment for pupils rooted in mutual respect, the appraiser, so we're looking at Wiley's record here. Wiley working with his appraiser, this is their shared view of Wiley's performance or current practice in terms of this area. For 1.1.2, setting goals that stretch and challenge pupils of all backgrounds, the shared understanding of practice over time between Wiley and his appraiser is that his performance in this area is outstanding. So the basic premise of the application, the way that we would advocate that schools maintain an over time continuous development model, is that working between the appraiser and the appraisee, they maintain this record. A very important point to make here is that neither the appraisee nor the appraiser can make arbitrary changes to their record. Any change to this record requires the other party to agree to it. So Wiley can't simply go down this column here and think he's outstanding in everything. He may well think he is, but his appraiser would need to acknowledge that request and agree to it. In much the same way, the appraiser also couldn't make changes arbitrarily without Wiley without acknowledging and accepting the changes. A key mantra we work with our schools around this is no surprises. So at any point in time, there should be nobody in the organisation who's unaware of the current level of performance of an individual. I'm going to touch upon evidence later in the next few minutes, but in order to help the appraiser and the appraisee make decisions about performance, we would expect some evidence to be stored either by the appraisee, or we'll have a look at how we manage lesson observations and other self-evaluation systems into people's records automatically. So the basic premise of this is it's no more complicated than having a list of things in my job, working with my appraiser and understanding how well I am doing those parts of my job, essentially. Coming out of my understanding of this area here, we would probably be setting objectives for this colleague moving forward. I'm going to touch upon that in the next few minutes. I'm just going to work my way through now a couple of different performance frameworks for you to have a look at these working. So the next framework, this is a framework we use in many schools for looking at the performance of leaders. And again, it's a very similar model. We would expect teachers to be maintaining the teaching framework, which is teacher standards in the previous instance. And for school leaders, we have a leadership framework. But equally, this could be the leadership framework for your context. Every school gets a bespoke solution. So in this instance here, we have a domain called Leading Colleagues and Building Teams, a second domain called Leading Professional Development. And again, over time, looking at the last 2 to 3 years of practice, we'd expect the colleague to be indicating with their appraiser where they feel their practice is. So this particular individual, 26 of the items in the framework here are outstanding, and 1 of them is good. So if one was setting developmental aims for this particular individual, it would probably be focusing on this standard here, giving feedback and to providing support for improving performance. Same concepts. The next framework is for teaching assistants. Okay, and what you'll probably see between the previous slide and this slide is that the level of challenge in terms of these areas differs somewhat. Okay, this is a little more straightforward in terms of its articulation of performance, whereas the previous slide was more aspirational. So we've looked at teachers, leaders, teaching assistants. This is an example of a framework from one of our international schools in Abu Dhabi, who launched about 4 weeks ago. And the key point that we'd make to school leaders is when we develop these frameworks of performance, they very much need to reflect the culture and expectations of the school in which they're going to be used. So in this instance here, this is an example of a performance framework that this particular school wanted to look at in terms of its performance. And if you notice on the right-hand side here, okay, they've used a different grading structure, and this one ties in with the grading structure of their inspectorate. So again, these are defined by the school. Some schools look at expert, embedded, developing, and others would use more summative comments here. And again, that is a decision made by schools regarding their context. Another item from an international school. Okay, this one is from a school in Dubai. And this one is very squarely associated. The project scope here is to make this, to interface this project with the inspection framework for Dubai. So if you're familiar with that framework, you'll understand where these items come from here, basically. And again, we have a different grading structure because this is hello everybody, apologies for that. There was a power cut in the building, literally a 1-second power cut. I was just talking regarding the international example of our KHDA interface here. So the summary point regarding this is that when we look at performance frameworks, each of these essentially is defined by schools. And the main concept behind this is that all colleagues in the organization have an up-to-date real understanding of their performance. I'm just going to slip through to a couple more of these, and these will be available for you to have a look at in the presentation when we issue the recording. So to summarize, one of our key ideas regarding appraisal and performance management is that it should be a continuous development model. In terms of objectives should be serving in order to improve the performance of the individual, but the main focus should be upon having an up-to-date, accurate, real-time understanding of the strengths and areas for development of individuals. And a question here for us regarding objectives is, where schools now have an up-to-date agreed position of performance at quite a granular level of each individual, should objectives now be linked to academic years, or would they to be linked to the development needs of the individual, much as you may perhaps support learners in their development? Our view is it should probably be a mixture of both. Some school-based objectives mixed with some individual development objectives for the individual. And little and often is a favourite term of ours. Okay, we're going to look next at visualizing performance. And one of the key themes coming out of the work that we do with schools is that school leaders they ask us, they tell us that they know what's going on, but it's foggy and it's grey, and they can't pin their finger on things. So I just want you to think about, if you have an instance where you have 20 or 30 teachers using the same performance framework, what kind of information we can present to you. So we're going to have a quick look at some of the things we're doing with school leaders regarding visualizing performance. And our starting position is that if we think we have one of these for 20 or 30 people, okay, one of the screens that we're able to present to school leaders is a very simple summary of who are our best practitioners, who are the strongest practitioners. So looking at this example here, I have 6 colleagues along the left-hand side. These are the colleagues for whom I have appraisal responsibility. And all the application is doing at this level is just telling me, looking at their standards and telling me what's happening. So if we look at Guillermo here, we can see with Guillermo that Guillermo's practice is a mixture of outstanding and good practice. 45% is outstanding and the remainder is good. If we look at Malek, Malek is a very high performing practitioner, and his practice is 100% outstanding. Equally, we can begin to see that Garrett Gruber here, his practice is a mixture of is requiring improvement and inadequate. Now, we place Garrett into these slides for demonstration purposes, essentially to show if this was a real instance, this colleague would be clearly in receipt of some quite intensive support. That's one report. A second report would be for, it's the same data, but we're presenting this for external audiences. And all we've done here is saving time for colleagues in articulating performance to governors or inspectors. It's the same data, but we've flicked the switch to indicate that this now is anonymous. So this level of information is normally presented to an external audience like a governor or an inspector. And the main point behind this is that it's extremely efficient. No time is wasted in terms of preparing the data twice. This screen is extremely interesting. Rather than looking at the performance of the individuals within the framework, it's looking at the performance of the whole organization within the framework itself. So if we look at the first area here, okay, this is something that we asked about our colleagues. This is part of our framework. Is work challenging enough for learners? Does it meet their individual needs? You can see here the breakdown is that about a third of practice is outstanding, around half is good, and about a fifth requires improvement. The key point here being, as a school leader, this information is available for free. You haven't got to do anything. It just arrives basically as a byproduct of having a really robust appraiser-appraisee relationship. And you know that this is good information. Now, interestingly, if we were looking at development aims coming out of this particular school, one might suggest that it's this area here and this area here that require immediate support for this particular school. So does teaching engage learners and promote positive attitudes to learning? There's a lot of expertise in the school, and the point that we would make regarding this is that if were we to drill down through this, we can identify who the best practitioners are, and we'd advocate that it's these people who should be supporting or driving the development function within the organization to improve this practice. We have the same thing here for behavior and so forth. So again, just very neatly, very efficiently, coming out of having that performance framework relationship between the appraiser and the appraisee, we can begin to articulate school level information very, very easily. One thing the school leaders are often asked about is to look at the impact of their practice. And what I've done on this particular next screen is I've asked the application to give me a view of the school as it is today, or yesterday, and a view of the school as it was a year ago, or 18 months ago. And I'm going to have a look at this area here. We looked at this on the previous screen, and I want you to compare where we are today in the school with where we were rather at a point in time. So we were uncomfortable with this figure, but if you notice this area here, we've made significant progress in impact on this over the course of the last 18 months. So again, this is a byproduct of just maintaining records calmly over time, and the application monitoring and answering questions for us. And very quickly here, a year ago, colleague 1 was underperforming, or colleague 2 rather, and a year on, his practice has stayed static. So again, if you're speaking to governors regarding this, it's quite easy to indicate the impact of the school improvement against the framework or the individual. And again, the point to make here is that there's no work for school leaders. All this just comes from asking a question based on the behaviour of the appraiser and the appraisee. Okay, we're going to move forward now to a very, very brief look at managing evidence. We have quite a light touch view of evidence. We would expect evidence to be held where necessary. And one of the key points that we know that school leaders want help or support with is this question here. Mark Semmons is a headmaster of a large independent school in the UK, and as he says here, he's got paper in one building, paper in another building, and he wants that information presented to appraisers efficiently and effectively. We have a very, very straightforward way of doing this. Where schools have items like lesson observations, or if they have pupil progress meetings, or any information that is filled in on a form linked to the school's self-evaluation or quality assurance model, we're able to identify when those things occur. So from here, for instance, very quickly, as a school leader, we're expecting that event to have happened for these colleagues. It has happened for all of them. It didn't happen for this colleague. Sitting behind these forms are bespoke forms for this particular school. And again, we work with schools to articulate these questions for them, or with them rather. So this is just a copy of a form that exists in the school. It can have closed questions or judgment questions. It could have these kinds of questions. And the key point we'd make here is, as these forms are completed, we can pass those forms back directly into the evidence folders for specific areas of the framework. So if the form is looking at assessment, for instance, we would place a copy of that form in the framework items linked to assessment. The idea being that existing actions which occur in the school, we hold the information or collect the information and pass it back intelligently back to the framework, so that when the appraiser and the appraisee come to meet, an evidence base is building as a byproduct of what the school is doing around lesson observations, work scrutinies, and other quality events. And again, if that's something that's of interest to you, we can pick that up in more detail in a follow-up session. Very briefly here, where we ask questions from forms, we're also able to present that information graphically. So from a school improvement point of view, if you're asking this question, we've got the whole school overview, but we've also passed this information back into the record of the individual. So they don't see the whole record, they just see their own. So this person would have had requires improvement, and the school can see a tally summary of these. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I want to move through pay progression very quickly. Pay progression, this is a question put to us by an international school leader. How to make sure that my best people are recognized objectively, and how to do this professionally for those who aren't progressing as expected. I'm not going to spend much time on this. We have a very simple understanding of pay progression. We think pay progression needs three things. Number one is an understanding of what your role needs you to do, a framework. Two, an understanding of how well you're performing within that framework. And 3, crucially, and this is the nub of the matter, there needs to be an agreed articulation of the expected levels of performance. Okay, if you don't have an expected understanding or an agreed articulation of expected performance, we'd counter it's very difficult to judge whether somebody is performing at, above, or below their expected performance levels. And when we speak with school leaders around this, the bottom question there is something that we always put to them. Do you expect the same from someone at point 1 in your pay scale as you do from somebody higher up the pay scale? Do your colleagues know what's expected of them? Is it transparent and is it equitable? And ultimately, the key question around pay progression, ought we to be rewarding people regarding their skill and their impact, or their time served? And therein lies the sea change. Now, the next slide, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but it literally is an example of how one of our schools has begun to articulate different levels of expected performance in relation to pay progression. Okay, so this school has divided its pay point. It has 3 pay points, it has 9 pay points, and they have 3 bands of performance. This is what they expect of their teachers in the first 3 points. This is what they expect of their teachers in the next 3 points. And this column will summarize the performance of their most highest paid colleagues. And extremely simply, all we're seeing is an articulation of expected performance, which is increasing in line with pay. So if we look at professional outcomes in this particular school, the expectation is that for professional outcomes, and these are the items from the performance framework linked to outcomes. So if we went back to our teaching standards, these standards link to professional outcomes. So this school is saying nearly all standards linked to this area should be good or better. So 90% of these standards ought to be good or better. So they're acknowledging that a teacher at this pay point, or these pay points rather, might have some area of practice which requires improvement. When we move to the next area, this school is articulating that all standards should at least be good, with a minority outstanding. So they're expecting to see people moving from good to outstanding when they get into the second pay band here. And thirdly, for someone to be eligible for the highest pay points, what they're expecting here is significant numbers of pupils exceed school expectations. All linked standards should be at least good, with many outstanding. So if we were to apply this set of criteria for this colleague, they would be sitting, they would tick this area here. Their practice, looking at the performance framework, the 6 linked standards or 6 areas to professional outcomes are 5 of them or 6 of them are outstanding, and 1 of them is good. Now, the key point behind this, and I'm not going to labor this anymore, this is a very visual process. This articulation, we help schools articulate this. Some schools have greater expectations than others, and others have lower expectations. But the key thing is, staff are engaged in developing this framework, and if you were discussing performance-related pay with a colleague at the start of the academic year and asking them, do they intend seeking pay progression, this clearly sets out whether this person would be applicable to move to the next band, essentially. And I'm not going to labor this any more than that. All it is structuring the pay structure here across the top and setting out an increasing continuum of expectation. And what we do quite nicely is we've already got the information regarding performance. We tell the appraiser and the appraisee, this is what we know about your practice for the items linked to professional practice. And again, if you'd like to discuss that in more detail with us, this is a very quick view of this. We're more than happy to spend some time with you looking at that beyond today. Okay, so we're gonna close out this presentation this morning. I'm 2 or 3 minutes longer than I hope to be. A question we ask schools regarding pay progression are these 3 questions at the bottom here. And again, if pay progression is something that is of interest to you, Just as a passing comment, of the last sort of 3 or 4 international projects that we've done, 3 of those schools have been interested in interfacing pay progression. So it might not be an interest of yours at this point in time, but it's a trend that we're beginning to see from the international sector as well as the maintained sector here. Okay, I'm very, very quickly going to close it on how we work with schools. We take care of everything. We've got a very nice total quality experience delivery model, TQE. And if you click on that link when you get the copy of this presentation, you'll have a look at that. Training in terms of the way we work with schools, it's either a blended model of on-site or through our technology. We've got a very professional training system which we've developed to support schools. So the project in Abu Dhabi, for instance, we haven't gone on site there. All training's been done directly through our professional learning and management platform. And other schools like the Geneva School, we spent quite a bit of time on the ground in the school there, looking at policies, procedures, and as well as the technology. And at the bottom there, we also have access to colleagues here who can support around training appraisers in being an appraiser, which is clearly a very valued skill, and we can consult around policies, pay progression, etc. And again, that's either done on site or it's done via technology. I'm not going to get into too much detail of that. We can share that with you again if you're interested in what we've talked about this morning. So hopefully this morning it's been quite informative. Our view is very simple. All we have is a list of things linked to my job and an understanding of how well we do them. We're very, very keen that partnership and reciprocal arrangements undersit all of this, and it should be a developmental process, identifying what people are good at and what they need help with, abstracting that to the level of the school, and ultimately, we very much feel that it's the responsibility of the individual when they can see their performance mapped out clearly for them. Working with their appraiser, working with their school, it's their responsibility. And accountability really to manage their own development. So that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. Some contact details here. My name's Leyton, my email address is there, and Katie's is sitting underneath there. Now, if we'd like to ask any questions, in the questions tab on your console, if you'd like to ask me any questions, I'm happy to sort of provide any responses or go back into the presentation and provide some more information if you'd like to do that. So everyone wants to ask any questions, just to pop them into the console there. In terms of, we've got a question here regarding how often the framework is maintained. What we would suggest in terms of the framework, let me just quickly go back to a framework. The model of using the application is that we would expect this to be a moving model. So if we take this example here, essentially, what we're keen to move away from, using viewing performance management as a transactional sort of Christmas, Easter, summer process. This is an always available real-time record of performance. If we look at this individual here, their level of practice is a mixture of good and requiring improvement. We'd expect in this instance, as an example, the appraiser and the appraised to be working together quite often, once every half term, once every 4 weeks, to be looking at practice to bring it up from requiring improvement to good. Where colleagues are performing at a higher level, we probably expect the appraiser and the appraisee to meet with each other once a term, perhaps. You know, this would be a very light touch piece of work between the appraisee and the appraiser, whereas this one will be quite an intensive area, and we'd expect the appraisee and the appraiser to be meeting quite often. And in actual fact, in this instance, we'd be probably setting this individual short-term goals every week, every 2 weeks, in order to bring their progress up to scratch, essentially. Okay. Another question is coming in regarding the use of gradings, outstanding, good, requiring improvement, and inadequate. These are defined by the school. We would support schools in terms of articulating these. And one question that's asked of us is whether or not do we have criteria for describing what these are? Okay, the answer is yes and no. We've got examples of criteria here. This instance has come from the KHDA inspection service document, and there is a very clear articulation of what outstanding means, what very good means, and so forth. So we can support schools in developing criteria for articulating performance, and where it already exists, we're also able to use that. But the key point is that we would advocate here is that there ought to be, in any organisation, a very clear shared understanding of what excellent practice looks like, what good practice looks like, what acceptable practice looks like. And we think that engaging with colleagues to articulate this. One of the key things that we talk about is staff engagement, and we very much wouldn't foist this upon staff. In many organisations, it's staff themselves who come up with these frameworks. They look at their jobs, look at their job descriptions, or they look at other documents, and they themselves come up with the framework for their own role. And we find that very developmental, it's very instructive, and ultimately, strategically, it also engages staff in the whole process. So the framework isn't foisted upon them. They've had input to the framework, and in many organisations, we then ask, we run workshops and we ask staff, okay, well, if we look at this part of the framework, let's just take an example of providing support for learning activities. So we sit down with these colleagues, or the school sits down with them, and they just thrash out, okay, well, what does outstanding look like? What would good look like? And what would requiring improvement look like? And we find where staff engage in that process together, it's an incredibly sort of informative process for them in terms of improving their understanding and the organisation's understanding of what excellent practice looks like, what good practice looks like, and so forth. And putting on my school inspector hat, it's very important that all members of school or staff in the school understand what excellent looks like, because that's what we're all striving to achieve. If we don't have a shared understanding, it's quite hard to understand if we're there or not at this point in time. Okay, we've been online now for about 45 minutes. We intended running about 30 minutes of presentation and 10 to 15 for Q&A. So I'm happy, unless anybody has any more questions, I'm happy to wrap this up at this point in time. Katie will forward the recording to you. In the meantime, if anybody wants to probe or query any of the points that I've made, as I mentioned on my presentation at the end here, my contact details are on Katie's, right at the very end here. He says, 1 second, slideshow from current slide. Okay, we'll put this on the back end, but my contact details are there on Katie's as well. So all that's left to do now, thank you, is to say thank you very much for your time this morning. And I hope that's been informative, and we're more than happy to spend some more time with you individually speaking about this and exploring some other ideas. Okay, thank you very much.